October 24th, 1992. Do you remember where you were? Maybe you were crowded around a television in a living room that smelled like popcorn and nervous energy. Maybe you were at a bar somewhere in Toronto or Winnipeg or Vancouver, shoulder to shoulder with strangers who suddenly felt like family. Maybe you were a kid, staying up past your bedtime, because your dad said this was important. This was history, and it was. That night, for the first time in the history of Major League Baseball, the World Series trophy left the United States. A Canadian team had done what no one thought possible. The Toronto Blue Jays didn't just win a championship, they gave an entire country something it had never felt before. But before we get to that night, we need to understand what brought Canada to that moment in the first place. The Toronto Blue Jays were a young franchise by any measure. Founded in 1977, they were barely 15 years old when the 1992 season began. In baseball terms, that is still a teenager. And yet by the early 90s they had grown into something far larger than a ball club. They had become a point of national pride. Skydome was part of that story. Opened in 1989 with its retractable roof and its gleaming concourses, it felt like a statement. Toronto was not a city content to play second fiddle. This was a metropolis growing into its own identity, multicultural and ambitious, drawing people from every corner of the world and becoming something genuinely new. Canada in 1992 was a country that had recently dazzled the world at the Calgary Olympics, that had sent its athletes onto global stages and watched them compete with the best. What it had not yet done was win a major North American professional championship. That hunger was real, and as the 1992 season unfolded, game by game through the long summer, something in the air felt different. Fans could sense it. This team, this year, felt like it was building towards something. This was not a team that stumbled into October. The 1992 Toronto Blue Jays were built to win, assembled piece by piece with intention and patience. And by the time the season reached its final months, the roster read like a carefully composed piece of music, where every instrument knew its part. Joe Carter was the heartbeat of the lineup. Powerful, electric, and impossible to ignore. He brought an energy to the clubhouse that spread into the stands and beyond. When Carter came to the plate with men on base, something in the air shifted. Fans leaned forward. Pitchers grew careful. That kind of presence is not something you can manufacture. Roberto Alomar was simply extraordinary. At 24 years old, he was already being spoken about as one of the finest second basemen the game had ever produced. Graceful, instinctive, and dangerous both at the plate and in the field, he made the game look effortless in the way that only the truly gifted can. Then there was Dave Winfield, 40 years old and still hungry, still chasing the championship that had eluded him through a long and storied career. His presence in that clubhouse carried the weight of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. Jack Morris anchored the rotation with the calm authority of a man who had been in big games before and was not afraid of them. And leading all of it was Cito Gaston. Quiet, steady, and deeply respected, he would become the first black manager in history to lead a team to the World Series. His steadiness gave the team its foundation. They played loose, they played together, and they believed. The path to October had already tested them. What came next would define them. The road to the World Series does not begin on a warm October night. It begins earlier, in the grinding pressure of a championship series where one bad game can end everything. Standing between the Blue Jays and the World Series were the Oakland Athletics, a proud and battle-hardened franchise that did not give anything away easily. The American League Championship Series was exactly the kind of series that tests a team's character. Leads evaporated, momentum shifted. Every game carried the particular weight of a season that could end at any moment. Toronto had been close before and walked away with nothing. That memory lived in the fan base. It lived in the players too, but something was different this time. From St. John's to Victoria, Canadians were paying attention in a way that went beyond casual interest. Newspapers ran the box scores on the front page. School children memorized batting averages. Offices buzzed through the mornings with the kind of conversation that only October baseball can produce. This was no longer just a Toronto story. It had become a national one. When the Blue Jays finally clinched the series and punched their ticket to the World Series, the country exhaled and then erupted. From coast to coast, something felt possible that had never felt possible before. Waiting for them in the Fall Classic were the Atlanta Braves, a fierce and hungry team with championship ambitions of their own. The stage was set, and Canada was watching. The World Series arrives with a weight that no other sporting event quite replicates. There is something about October baseball, about the anthem echoing through a packed stadium, about the way the crowd holds its breath before the first pitch, that feels less like a game and more like a ceremony. When the 1992 World Series opened, two proud franchises stood across from each other with everything on the line. The Atlanta Braves were not a team you could take lightly. They were skilled, experienced, and deeply motivated. Their fans were loud, and their roster was deep. This was going to be earned, if it was going to be earned at all. Across Canada, something almost ritualistic was taking place. Hockey fans, lifelong devotees of an entirely different sport, set aside their loyalties without hesitation. Offices emptied early. Dinner was eaten in front of the television. Communities gathered in living rooms and bars and community centers with a shared focus that only comes around once in a very long while. The early games did nothing to ease the tension. The series was tight and competitive, neither team able to pull away and breathe easily. Momentum shifted back and forth like a tide that could not decide where to land. Every Toronto win was followed by Atlanta answering back. Every promising moment carried the shadow of doubt. Canada had stood near the edge of greatness before and stepped back with nothing. That history sat quietly in the back of every fan's mind as the series moved deeper into October. By the time Game 6 arrived, the country was holding its breath as one. October 24, 1992, Atlanta Fulton County Stadium. Game 6 of the World Series. This was the night that everything either came together or fell apart. The game itself was exactly what the series had promised. Tense, shifting, and unforgiving. The Blue Jays took a lead. The Braves answered. The lead changed hands, the way momentum does in October baseball, never settling, never allowing anyone in the stadium or watching from thousands of kilometers away to fully relax. Every at-bat felt enormous. Every out felt like a small reprieve. The innings passed slowly, each one loaded with consequence. By the time the game reached the 11th inning, the score was tied. The Blue Jays were on the road, in an enemy stadium, in front of a crowd that wanted them to fail. In living rooms across Canada, people had stopped talking. Some had stopped sitting. There were hands gripping armrests and people pacing kitchen floors who could not bring themselves to watch and could not bring themselves to look away. 2 outs in the top of the 11th. The season balanced on a single moment. Then Dave Winfield stepped in, 40 years old, a career spent chasing this exact moment. He swung, and the ball found the gap, and it rolled to the wall, and 2 runs scored. The Blue Jays had the lead. When the final out was recorded in the bottom of that inning, when the Blue Jays rushed onto the field in Atlanta and the celebration began, something extraordinary happened across an entire country simultaneously. In Toronto and Halifax and Winnipeg and Vancouver, in small towns and on quiet streets and in packed bars, Canada erupted. People ran outside into the October cold and screamed at the sky. Strangers embraced. Car horns filled the night. For the first time in history, the World Series trophy was coming to Canada. The field in Atlanta was chaos and joy in equal measure. The Blue Jays piled onto each other in the way that championship teams do. All restraint abandoned. All the pressure of a long season releasing at once. Joe Carter moved through the celebration with tears streaming and a smile that seemed too large for his face. Roberto Alomar, so composed throughout the series, let everything go. Dave Winfield, the man who had waited 40 years for this moment, held the feeling like someone who understood exactly how rare it was. But the real celebration was happening thousands of kilometers away. Yonge Street in Toronto became something unrecognizable, a sea of people, shoulder to shoulder, pouring out of bars and apartments and side streets, waving flags and screaming into the night air. In Halifax and Calgary and cities in between, car horns started and did not stop. People who had watched alone rushed outside just to be near other people, needing to share what they were feeling with anyone who would meet their eyes. There was something distinctly Canadian about the way the country received this moment. It was joyful, yes, overwhelmingly so, but underneath the noise was something quieter, a kind of disbelief. A modest country, unaccustomed to being first, suddenly finding itself exactly there. The celebration was real, and it was loud, but even as it unfolded, something deeper was beginning to settle in. When the noise settled and the confetti was swept away, what remained was something worth looking at more carefully. The 1992 Toronto Blue Jays were not simply a great baseball team, they were a reflection of something that Canada was in the process of becoming. Look at that roster and you saw players from the Dominican Republic, from Venezuela, from the United States, from Canada itself. Different backgrounds, different languages, different stories, all converging under a single flag on the biggest stage in the sport. In that sense, the team was already saying something before a single pitch was thrown. And then there was Cito Gaston. Quiet, dignified, and deeply purposeful, he became the first black manager in the history of baseball to win a World Series. That fact deserves to be held for a moment, rather than passed over quickly. It was significant far beyond the sport itself, a marker of something shifting, something opening up, in a game that had not always reflected the diversity of the people who loved it. There is also something quietly profound in what Canada did that October. A country that had spent much of its history defining itself in relation to its American neighbor had just beaten America at its own game, in its most American sport, on American soil. That is not a small thing. It carried a particular satisfaction that Canadians recognized even if they did not always say it out loud. The Blue Jays had always been a baseball team. After October 24, 1992, they became something more. They became a symbol of what Canada was growing into, and a reminder of what a country looks like when it plays together. The story did not end on October 24, 1992. If anything, it was just beginning. The following season, the Blue Jays returned to the World Series and won it again. Back-to-back championships, something that had never been done in the modern era of baseball's free agency landscape. Canada had not just won once. It had proven the first time was no accident. Roberto Alomar went on to the Hall of Fame. So did Dave Winfield, whose career arc finally had the ending it deserved. These were not just great Blue Jays. They were among the greatest players the game has ever produced. In the years that followed, the championship window gradually closed, as all windows do. The roster changed, the league shifted, and the Blue Jays have not been back to the World Series since those two extraordinary years. That absence does not diminish what was built. If anything, it makes those seasons feel more precious. The way any rare thing becomes more valuable once you understand it cannot simply be repeated on demand. Today, Canadians who lived through 1992 and 1993 speak about those years the way people speak about things that genuinely mattered. The anniversaries are marked. The reunions draw attention. The documentaries find an audience that is still hungry for the feeling. There are memories worth holding on to before you let them go. This is one of them. So here we are, more than 30 years later, and that night still holds its shape. Maybe you were there for it. Maybe you were young enough that the memory lives in fragments. The sound of the television, the way the adults in the room reacted, the feeling that something important was happening, even if you could not fully name it yet. Maybe you heard about it afterward, from a parent or a grandparent who described it the way people describe things they never quite got over. Sports moments like this one are not really about baseball. They never are. They are about where you were and who you were with, and what you felt in a moment that belonged to everyone at once. In a country as vast and varied as Canada, those moments of genuine shared feeling are rarer than we sometimes admit. We are a big country with a lot of distance between us. But on October 24, 1992, that distance disappeared for a few hours, and that is worth remembering. If you remember that night, we would love to hear about it. Tell us in the comments where you were, who you watched with, and what you felt when that final out was recorded. Those stories belong here. If you love Canadian history and the moments that shaped this country, subscribe and stay with us. There are more stories worth telling, and we are not finished yet.